Well, welcome to this episode of Work Punks, where we try to stick the needle in accepted working practices. We have Ben Simpson, Colin Newlyn, and myself, Paul Jansen, today, sharing our views on working practices, good, bad, or indifferent. Colin.
I'm going to talk about the 4-day week today. I went to a meeting of Reinventing Work London, and it was about the 4-day week. It was held at the Happy offices, because Happy are one of the companies taking part in the UK trial. And we heard from the very splendid Henry Stewart, who's the Chief Happiness Officer. The trial's been a big success. All the people that took part in it are still running it. The report has come out for the US. The UK one comes out in February. But some things are quite clear, and Henry shared his experiences of this in his organisation, which is people have been able to cut from a 5-day week to a 4-day week. They get the same salary, but they just work 1 day less. And there's been no drop off in productivity. In some cases, like in Henry's cases, they seem to have had an increase in performance, although how much is attributable to the trial or just circumstantial is a bit hard to tell. But what he has seen is a big increase in well-being, people feeling, far happier, fewer sick days, that sort of thing. What the people from the 4-day week advise is that you go to the staff and ask them where they can, make savings in pointless activities. And I mean, for anyone who's worked in an organisation, you know that you spend at least a day doing stuff that's completely and utterly pointless and a waste of time. So it shouldn't really be a surprise that people can find a day. But they start with looking at their own productivity. So actually, Henry runs a course which he sells to people called the Productivity Blitz, and it's got all sort of tips like Pomodoro techniques and prioritization and stuff like that. So his staff all did that, which I hadn't done it before, surprisingly. So they're able to make big improvements in their own productivity. And mostly what goes are pointless meetings and busy work, unessential bureaucracy, stuff like that can all be cut out. One of the things that really interested me about it was he said that not only were people able to cut down to 4 days a week, but whereas on 5 days a week they were overworking, they were staying an extra hour or so to sort something out. Now they've got their productivity sorted, they're not doing that. They've cut more than a day out in effect because they're much more focused. And I suspect that part of the well-being benefit is that people feel much more in control of what they're doing. That for it to work, you've got to have a good culture. So you've got to have a trusted environment. You've got to be an organisation that gives people autonomy, which they do. So it's not a fix for a bad culture. It's something to build on. And the other thing that struck me was I'd always thought, I'd been thinking that maybe it was a bit late. Do we really need the 4-day week? Because now we're all moving towards, distributed working and more flexibility. But I've had a bit of a reassessment because I think it's a bit of a statement of intent to people that we only expect you to work we expect you to do your work in 4 days, and we don't expect you to do anything outside of that. And it's also a statement of intent to the people that you've got this extra time, so use it for yourself. Don't let work dribble into it. Focus on your well-being or education or health or whatever you want to do. So so it's sort of I'm much more pro the 4-day week than I was before, actually.
Sounds really intriguing, doesn't it? I just wondered when I heard you talk about this, whether by making this explicit, this transition from a normal 5-day working week to a 4-day working week, was it that staff felt more empowered to actually say no to certain activities, say no to certain meetings, and therefore were able to indeed focus their work in those 4 days that they had available to them?
It makes them consciously address the issue, whereas even people that are now working in a hybrid or more flexible way, okay, they're saving on the commute time, they're able to manage their time better, but they're not actually working fewer hours because they're still doing all the rubbish they were doing before. They're still doing busy work. Whereas this actually makes them figure out what's the busy work and what's productive and focus on the productive stuff.
A tiny little organisation that's kind of known to us down here in Bath, they're probably only 4 or 5 years old, but they're at least a year down the line with the 4-day week. They kind of went one step further almost, in so much as the deal is we are paying you for 5 days. Therefore, you do 4 days doing, the good work that you do for our little company, and we are giving you day 5, but specifically to work on your well-being. And it's Friday. When we have our team huddle on Monday morning, we're all going to be sharing stories of what we did on Friday. We are paying you, so therefore, so then there's this thing about control almost. So you're giving a day, but for instance, in that organisation, it would not go down well to say, well, I just did chores around the house, or I just did this, or I just did that. The expectation is that you do the things that, through science we know are good for our well-being, connecting and reconnecting with people, getting out into the outdoors, doing some exercise, all of that good stuff. And it's quite interesting because they ended up, they tried to write this into their little employee handbook, and all of a sudden it raised all sorts of questions. No, you've given me the day, you can't control me. And
it does seem to be counterproductive to give people the autonomy over their work and then tell them what to do on their day off. But and for some people doing the chores, if they're a busy mum or dad, with what life's like when you got a couple of kids and stuff, it's manic. Having a day where you can say, right, I can do the chores and I can just focus on the kids at the weekend is actually a big benefit for people.
So, Colin, do you think that this 4-day approach might be better than the flexible approach that doesn't talk about hours at all and essentially says, look, we agree how you contribute, what your outcomes are, what your targets are, and how you achieve that in how many hours we don't care about?
I think it's a bit of horses for courses. So because like someone like Happy, they're a training organisation, so they've got there's quite a lot of structured. It's got to have a certain amount of time delivering. Yeah, they've got to get a certain number of courses to keep their revenues up. I think it's more appropriate in those situations. So they don't all have the same day off. They have different days off, so they've always got cover. So in that sort of more operational environment, I think it's perhaps a better solution. But if it's if it's a very creative environment, maybe not. Maybe that's not the way forward. But I think emphasising that we expect you to do your job in 32 hours and no more. Yeah, I think that's an important focus.
Yeah.
There's a symbolism aspect to that.
Yeah.
So
it's a statement of intent, isn't it?
Yeah, I was reminded of the legend or fable. Taiichi Ohno, the kind of architect of the Toyota production system, was a very demanding individual. But I remember one of the things that he's fabled for doing was going into a facility and they'd not come up to his level of expectation about how they were doing reducing inventory. So the fable goes, he demanded that somebody went off and got a circular saw, and someone went off and got a circular saw, and he set about the shelving, and he started cutting the depth of the shelves back. All these parts, pre-production inventory just going on the floor, all getting jumbled up, and he's literally chopping the shelves down. And then he said, beckon someone up, right, you carry on, finish the job. When I come back in a month's time, that's all you've got. So I've now confined your storage space, so that will solve the problem. So I'm kind of a fan of symbolism. It can wake us up and it can cause change. But I'm also, there's another big part of me that says, no, let's understand the reason why we found it so difficult to reduce our inventory down to a third, and let's address that, not just, tip everything onto the floor and create a load of extra work. But allegedly, kind of it worked. So
it's an interesting point. I was going to say about because a lot of the companies on this trial are quite small. The only big company that has adopted the 4-day week is IBM in Japan.
Right.
And that's very interesting because Japan has this overwork culture. In fact, most of Asia does. So maybe the real wins are actually in that part of the world where that symbolism is really, really important to overcome those that bias in the culture.
Perhaps a good moment to, although I've got lots more things that I would like to unpick on this on this topic of the 4-day working week, and especially the definition of pointless meetings. But for today, maybe Ben, you wanted to talk about other pointless things that are of more
Well,
paper-based
What are you
nature.
saying? Ben always talks about pointless things. I'm not right.
Yeah.
That's it.
Thanks, Paul. I like nothing more than to talk about pointless things. So a couple of things that occur to me out of that. So if Happy can find, which is a good organisation, right? If Happy can find 20% that's essentially non-value adding, non-purposeful in their organisation, then wow, so that to me really does give me hope. And as Colin has said, just about every other organisation I've ever been to, it's not even 20%, it's 30, 40, whatever. This guy, bullshit jobs, so the people that helped him with his research, 40% of people that wrote to David Note felt that they were engaged in meaningless work. And that's he talked a lot about the kind of psychological impact of that, but the level of waste is clearly huge. Gary Hamel, has been banging on about this for a long time. Like £3 trillion is his kind of headline in terms of the cost of bureaucracy in the States. The UK actually wouldn't be that different. I'm afraid to say that although the sort of organisations that we like to work with, the more progressive, sort of self-managing, high trust, high autonomy organisations are stemming the tide of that, I think that the tide is still going in the wrong direction. So I still think there's more and more waste and bureaucracy getting built into people's jobs and people's work, and it's not only is it wasteful, but it's unrewarding work. So that to me poses a question. So what is causing that? Why is that the case? In the 1980s, Peter Drucker predicted that organisations would, in this century, in the early part of this century, so where we are now, would have a third of the layers, I think, and half the number of managers. And in the intervening time, the number of managers per worker has doubled. So it's like, and my hope is that the 4-day week will raise people's consciousness. For me, the 4-day week is all absolutely about engaging with your people and understanding that by being more deliberate and choiceful about what it is that we do, that we can eliminate some of that stuff. And if that results in people sticking to 32 hours and not 40, 50, 60, then that's a good thing. What people want to know is, okay, but what do I need to do differently on Monday morning to start this journey? And what goes in the place of bureaucracy, right? So for me, absolute, radical transparency, high levels of trust, high levels of self-determination and autonomy, peer accountability, and not authoritarian accountability, and all of that good stuff.
So just as the point that we came across with Colin's story about 4-day working week, and we talked about pointless meetings, what elements make bureaucracy pointless, and what elements of bureaucracy make them, if that's the word, pointful, as in useful, because clearly I think it has evolved for probably a whole set of reasons to where we got to today, and therefore, where do you think organizations should start to challenge themselves on that?
Yeah. So to come back to your point about, presumably someone thought this was a good idea at some stage, otherwise it wouldn't have been there. There, it's very easy for me to go down the rabbit hole of, well, it's all about the illusion of control, and people at the top of organizations feel the need to be in control, and hence the meetings and the reports and all the rest of that. And, I think in this group, we're quite comfortable with the idea of control isn't real, it's kind of an illusion. But so that to me is kind of, we need to at least nod to the recognition that this has its roots in the kind of tacit assumptions that underpin traditional management, and control is clearly one of those. Lack of trust is another. But to answer your question specifically, otherwise I'm going to sound like a bloody politician. I think, you know, who determines what is pointful and pointless? Absolutely, you have to give that over to the team, and they need to work that out for themselves. You know, the recipient of the supposedly meaningless report needs to be in the room and articulate why they still feel that that laborious monthly process needs to be completed, and that requires other people in the room to be comfortable and safe in sharing what they really think. So, you know, all I'm doing really here is just echoing, probably not quite in such clean language as what, you know, Colin said about the culture needs to be right. But for me, if teams are going to come to the right decisions, then everybody really needs to show up in a place where they can tell it how it is, and that almost is a bit of a precondition for me. So yeah. I don't think there's a list of 10 bullet points that we can give over that will be have universal utility and applicability in any organisation. But what we can do is as ever be a guide to organisations and help them set the conditions where they can solve these problems themselves.
Yeah, I think the thing I was going to pick up was you said about tacit assumptions, and I think what we can do is highlight those and give people bigger awareness. So, you know, the 5-day 40-hour week is a complete thing plucked out of the air. It was what the unions managed to negotiate at the time. You know, in France they've done a 35-hour week for years. They're more productive than we are. Yeah. So we have these assumptions built into our thinking, which we need to destroy and make people aware of possibility. I mean, John Maynard Keynes said we'd be working 15 hours a week by now. So somewhere between 40 and 15 is probably the right answer.
Yeah, and I think the approach that you described, that the participants in that experiment on the 4-day working week followed and forced them also to, by constraining themselves to fewer hours, forced them to start looking for new ways of working and new ways of doing things and stopping doing certain things. I wonder whether you, as an organization, should look for a similar approach when aiming to reduce your bureaucracy. For instance, with policies, I sometimes suggest to organizations, why don't you start with your policies and procedures and force yourself to write them on 1 page each? The other day I'm involved with a certain organization that shared with me their travel expense policy. It was like 14 pages or something, and 13 of those pages were about essentially that I have to stick to the rules on the road, i.e. comply with the law. I mean, you could have summarized it with one line, comply with the law, and even that's patronizing. So you could even leave that line out. So if the underlying principle of the organization therefore becomes, I treat all my employees as adults, then I don't have to tell them 90% of the stuff that goes on in policies and procedures, right? So I think some of these pragmatic things might actually well be a first step. Leads to the topic that I wanted to touch upon today, the topic of psychological safety. So if you're going to treat people like adults, and if you're, I mean, Ben, you mentioned working with organizations and encouraging them to be, to introduce more trustful ways of working, then the concept of psychological safety becomes quite interesting, doesn't it? Because this psychological safety, the concept that was introduced by Amy Edmondson several years ago, essentially says very effective, high-performing teams, they show a behavior in which the team members can express themselves without fear of embarrassment, fear of being humiliated, punished, or any other sense of retribution or being ignored or blamed. And that means that they feel free and empowered to come up with ideas. They feel free to ask silly questions. They feel free to challenge each other on why are you doing it this way, why not that way. And they create a very essentially constructive climate in the team that helps them tackle, sticky problems, improve their interpersonal ways of working, and ultimately which ultimately results in better output and a better performing team. And that psychological safety is important for any team in any organization. But what's interesting, I think, is that one of the many aspects that I find fascinating about this is that it seems to come natural to some teams and not in other teams. So why is that? Even though these teams might be part of the same organization. And does that raise the question, therefore, that as an organization, it's quite difficult to influence that?
It's about safety, isn't it? It's about people just feeling safe. So there are some environmental issues around that, and particularly with diversity and inclusion and that sort of stuff. Some people feel comfortable in some environments, some don't. So if you've got someone who's not comfortable being in that office environment or in that in-person meeting, then they're never going to feel safe. But it's also about like what's the things that stop it happening. So, because you only need one person to be a bad actor in that situation, and it's not going to happen. So are there things that people either do consciously or perhaps even unconsciously? There are behaviours that people display that shatter that sense of safety.
Yeah, I think one eye roll during a meeting, or one person grabbing the mobile phone while the meeting is going on and tap away distractedly, immediately sends a message to the whole group, doesn't it?
Richard Clayton, who's someone we should all follow on LinkedIn, responding to a post I put up about psycho bosses. He was sort of questioning to what degree it's conscious and to what degree people are doing things without really thinking about it and not really understanding the impact that it's having. I think that's what you're alluding to, and we've probably all been guilty of that, sitting in a meeting and pulling your phone out or rolling the eyes and stuff, and it shatters that safety. And it's something that maybe just the consciousness of that is a precondition.
Yeah. Ben, what were you going to say?
Yeah, so this is something that I'm increasingly kind of becoming more self-aware of. So lots of people talk about the culture in organisations. So how we do things around here. I think we all know that the engine room for performance and culture doesn't reside at that kind of highest level in the organisation, but it resides within every natural work team within the organisation. So very much my unit of engagement is the team level rather than just working with the top team. If we're talking about the climate within teams as opposed to the culture of the organisation, and the climate being how it feels to be here as opposed to how we do things around here, then I think you're getting close to the nub of the issue. And I think that begs an opportunity to engage in a positive reinforcing cycle. Because I think the more that you open the door to people being open and have an opportunity to practice how you deal with good news, bad news, wacky ideas, or whatever, funnily enough, the better you get at it. So something that I think is really useful in the team setup is creating a space for retrospective feedback, not just on how's the project going in the last week, but how did I show up? How might I raise my game? How might I invest myself or show up differently that would improve the psychological safety of the group?
You've made an important distinction there between, I might not use the same terms, but the climate within the team and the culture in the organisation. And I think, a lot of companies try to address psychological safety at that cultural level, which is like, to me, the culture that people experience is what happens in the team. It's the climate. That's people's everyday experience. So that's where you've got to establish psychological safety.
So for me, it is important that the leadership demonstrates in their own behaviors, the kind of behaviors that they hope to see replicated in their teams. And I also think that there are some elements to psychological safety practices that enhance psychological safety that you can build into the accepted way of working in your teams and in your organizations. These well-functioning teams, for instance, have a high level of conversational turn-taking, as it's called, beautiful term. Essentially means everybody gets a chance to actually chip in and say something and contribute to the decision-making process and the creative processes. And some teams might do this naturally, but there's ways of building this into your processes and how you conduct meetings, for instance. And I think that's especially when you're thinking about more self-managing teams, then it's helpful to introduce these ways of conducting your meetings, your meeting practices and your decision-making practices, and make that part of, this is how we do things here, everybody. And I think then, as you alluded to, Ben, earlier on, then these processes help you also to make that just a natural part of your behavior and your thinking.
Don't the leadership have to have a humility here? They have to have a humility as to what they can achieve. They can set the conditions, but ultimately it's down to the chemistry and the behaviours of the people in the room, which they can't control. And as a counterpoint to that, you can have very high levels of psychological safety in a team that's sitting in a toxic environment, simply because those people, feel that they're all in the same. They might be, just covering each other's backs. It may be a siege mentality, but it's still a high level of psychological safety. So,
yeah. And the other point, I think, Colin, that you touched upon, which I found really interesting in a more recent piece that I read on psychological safety, is that element of diversity and inclusion. And here we are, three, let's say, middle-aged white men. We tend to be the ones that feel pretty safe in most teams that we operate in. And what this piece argued was actually that is not necessarily the same for everybody else who may have a different gender, different ethnicity, and all these aspects that, of course, form this rich tapestry of what diversity is all about. And ultimately, a team is really only as safe as how the individual feels that feels the most excluded on that team. So, and that's important to be aware of. And it opened my eyes certainly to looking at psychological safety slightly differently, or in a more nuanced way is probably a better way of putting that. So a piece worth reading. It's called Looking at Psychological Safety Through an Equity Lens by the August group. So look it up online if you're interested.
Yeah, just to pick up on that last point, I had a very direct experience of that. I had I chat with somebody yesterday in Australia who's a woman from Asian background who's championing women within her organisation, and particularly Asian women, because she points out that culturally they are, brought up to be quiet and not quite submissive, but sit in the background and ask questions. And in the Australian business culture, you're expected to stand up and speak what you think and challenge and put. So so she's helping, and she made that point exactly, that when they're in a meeting, they don't feel safe because they've got this cultural baggage they're having to go against. So she's helping them to get through that, so they can then be participants and become leaders of those meetings. So yeah, absolutely.
Great. Well, gentlemen, I think we've come to the end of this session of Work Punks. So if you, viewer, enjoyed this session, then like, support, subscribe, do whatever you need to do. And if you have suggestions for topics for a next episode, then do contact us. And perhaps you want to come in and become a guest speaker or part of this this virtual roundtable conversation. So looking forward to seeing you next time. Bye, everybody.
Cheerio.
Bye.